person is. Keep in mind, in Jesus' own lifetime, the term Messiah or anointed was not a reference to man's eternal oneness with God. In fact, the Greek term Christ was not even around or used in the time of Jesus. It seems, however, Paul is the one who saw his oneness with God as Christ. No longer I, but Christ lives in me. Had this been Jesus' understanding of Christ, he could have said the same thing. It is not I, but Christ lives in me. At any rate, because no specific terms or definitions were given to account for Hilary's two different states, the result has been much confusion, not only as regards the man Jesus, but the true nature of every man's earthly journey and final estate. In the literature, at least, the confusion has been mistaking the second state in which Jesus was born, theosis or unitive state, for as far as any man can go or ever attain, which obviously is not true. This is not what Christ revealed. What was not true for Jesus' spiritual life with God is not true for any man's life with God. The issue, however, is not what you call it, second and third states, but clarity as regards the difference between them. As said, for a true understanding of Christ, this difference is strategic. We might think of this as the difference between the icon of the man Jesus on the cross, the temporary earthly Christ, and the icon of the Eucharist, the eternal heavenly Christ. There is a huge difference. And of course, she has a whole chapter on the Eucharist soon. While a Christology based on the Eucharistic heavenly Christ is on the mark, unfortunately, there exists no Christology based on the earthly existence of Christ. While the Eucharist is the consummate or final nature of Christ's glorified human nature, the hypostatic union, this was not Christ's earthly human existence. Those who think there is no difference between man's earthly and eternal existence have missed Christ completely. The single most noteworthy difference, earthly and heavenly, is that in God, the hypostatic union is personless, whereas man's earthly union with God is in man himself, in his own person, in his own self or person, who after all knows and experiences his union with God, but man himself. The hypostatic union, on the other hand, is not a union or oneness of God with any person, self, or individual human being. Rather, this union is solely God's oneness with the essence of man's common human nature, an essence and union solely in God, and thus known only to God. And here I have scribbled between these paragraphs, when she says in God, she means not in man. In other words, not conscious. This eternal union in God is not a union with any property, person, or self, or with any accident extrinsic to the essence of human nature, none of which could possibly exist in eternal life anyway. People who think they can see God, live in the glory of God, participate in God's divine nature, and at the same time maintain any form of earthly existence such as they know it now, do not honestly know God. To think God's own human nature retains someone's earthly identity is absurd. The sole identity of God's own human nature is Christ. It was because human nature cannot live simultaneously in God's glorious dimension of existence and at the same time function in this world, this necessitated the kenosis of the Logos' human nature. As far as human nature can descend from its glorious estate in God without relinquishing the hypostatic union altogether, this was Hilary's second state, the union of God and man in this world, a union man knows and experiences within himself. So where the hypostatic union is solely in God, in contrast, man's earthly union with God is in himself. It is because God is no person and saves no person that the hypostatic union is totally personless. Thus, man's eternal oneness with God is impersonal and impartial, which is the measure of truth anyway, because God is not into man's partialities. So what is imperative to point out is that the hypostatic union in God and a mystical union in man denote two totally different unions. These are not just two different experiences, but rather two different realities, two different dimensions of existence. As the revelation of the real Christ, the hypostatic union is totally non-experiential, since there is no experiencer, and thus man's eternal union with God is absolutely personless and impersonal. And just thinking to myself now, the objections that some people may raise to this. She's positing to Christ. She's dividing up Christ. Well, there's something about a union of between two that is of the essence of Christ, and you have to articulate that and defend that and recognize that. Okay. On earth, Jesus, as a human person, knew and experienced his oneness with God. Certainly this was not God's experience. What Jesus or any person experiences and knows as his oneness with God is not a hypostatic union. Before this final union can even be revealed, all man knows and experiences of his own union with God has to be voided, ceased to exist. Why? Because this was his union with God and his individual personal oneness with God, which is not, however, God's oneness with its own universal human nature. So the difference is between, and she has 6 differences here, and sometimes she puts the individual first, and sometimes the common or collective second, and sometimes she reverses the order and puts the common or collective second and the individual or particular first. It's a little confusing, but she's trying to be clear. All the differences between the two. 1, the individual or particular, and the common or universal. 2, between the common essence of human nature and one individual human being. 3, between an individual person and no person. 4, between God's own human nature and man's own human nature. 5, between man's earthly oneness with God in himself and man's eternal oneness with God, and man's eternal oneness solely in God. 6, between man's experience of oneness with God and no experience of oneness with God. These two different unions, earthly and eternal, are unalike, even incompatible. As long as any person, subject, or self remains, man's eternal union cannot be revealed or ever known. Indeed, it was the loss of his experience of oneness with God, loss of his person, that was the true nature of Jesus' death. Seemingly, God left him. The resurrection, however, is the revelation of the hypostatic union. The essence of man's one universal human nature God created for itself alone and did not create for any particular human being. This is the eternal Christ. Obviously, the idea that God revealed one individual being or particular person as Christ is a wrong understanding of Christ. No truth to this whatsoever. Christ is not a particular person. In fact, God creates no person, and thus there is no person to be Christ. Where people think of Christ as other to themselves, yet Christ is neither other nor one's self. Christ is God's own common human nature. Man's eternal union with God, then, is neither his experience nor God's experience. God is impassible anyway. Yet this union or oneness is God's own knowing. For to have the mind of Christ is to have or participate in God's Logos' own wisdom. As truth itself, God's revelation of Christ is the truth of all mankind, and not merely one particular human being or person. As to whether